The Create Transaction form is part of the Extended Owner Register. To open the form, press the Owner Data button on the navigation toolbar. If the ownership type for the selected company is not the basic owner register on the company profile, the Extended Owner Register will open. Press the Create Transaction button. The transactions entered on the form are records of actual ownership transactions that have occurred between sellers and buyers. The upper part of the form contains the seller's side of the transaction. The seller's name and information on what is being sold is entered on the seller's side. The lower portion of the form contains the buyer's side of the transaction. The buyer's name or names and information on what was purchased is entered on the buyer's side. We'll start by entering a simple transaction where the selected company is making an initial offer for a portion of ownership in the company. Select the type of ownership for the transaction. Initial Offer is selected. The option buttons for the three types of owners cannot be selected because no transactions have been entered and there are no records for owners in the database. Let's move to the buyer's side of the transaction and enter information for who is acquiring the initial offer. Select one of the option buttons for the type of owner. The pull-down list under the individual owner option contains the names of people marked as associated with the company on the People profile. The pull-down under Group Owners are the name of associated groups from the Group Owners form. Names in the pull-down under Tracked Companies are all company names from the company profile except the currently selected company. The certificate number is automatically generated. To enter a different certificate number, use the alphanumeric ID. If there is data in the alphanumeric field, it will be used as the certificate number. Enter the amount paid or the value of what was traded in place of money. Enter the date of the transaction and the date ownership was transferred. Enter the number of shares or units transferred and the tax stamp ID if there is one. The default value for voting rights is already on the form. Press the Add button and the information is added to the grid at the bottom of the form. A batch of 5 initial offer transactions can be entered one after another without pressing the Create a Transaction button. There is a limit of 5 initial transactions per batch. When the maximum of 5 is reached, save the transactions before entering more. Press the button when ready, and separate records will be created for each initial offer transaction. Once owners have purchased a portion of ownership, records for other types of transactions can be entered. For example, records can be entered for a seller trading ownership with one or more buyers. The issuing company can buy back ownership, and multiple sellers can trade ownership with one or more buyers. Let's look at each type of transaction. When an owner has traded shares or units of ownership with one or more buyers, select one of the owner names on the seller's side. Records for the certificates held by the owner are displayed in the top grid. Put a check in front of the certificates being traded. The number of units of ownership on the buyer's side must equal the number on the seller's side. Select the name of a buyer and enter the number of units the buyer has purchased. Enter the rest of the information for the trade and press the Add button. If the number being purchased does not equal the amount being sold, additional buyers must be added. If the seller retains some ownership, enter the seller's name as a buyer for the amount that remains. When the number of shares or units that were bought equals the number sold, press the Create a Transaction button and a record for the transaction is added to the database. When the issuing company buys back ownership, select the Buyback option on the buyer's side. The rest of the transaction is essentially the same as other transactions. A buyback decreases the number of outstanding shares or units of ownership for the issuing company. When multiple sellers trade ownership with one or more buyers, the process requires creating a buyer called Multiple Seller on the Group Owners form. The multiple seller group can then be selected as a buyer from the Group Owners pull-down list. There can only be one seller at a time on the Enter Transactions form, so each seller needs to be entered in a separate transaction with the multiple seller group as the buyer. When records have been added for all the sellers with the multiple seller group as the buyer, a record can be created with the multiple seller group as the seller. Select each of the certificates that were added by the multiple seller group and add the buyers to the buyer's side of the transaction. When the number bought equals the number sold, press the Create a Transaction button. A multiple seller group must start and end the process with 0 ownership in the company. The View Certificates button opens the certificates form, which is described in a separate video.